This is the WGBH Forum Network.
The Creative Method. The National Association of Educational Broadcasters presents Lee Strasbeg on acting. Here first is Lyman Bryson.
Is the work of an actor truly creative, or is it just the interpretation of somebody else's creative work? An actor reads what somebody else has written. He goes through his paces under the close supervision of a director. He is working with other people who are trying harmoniously to carry out a concept of a play. Is this really creative? Is the theater creative in any case? Mr. Lee Strasbeg, in his conversation with Bill Cavness, has some very strong opinions on this subject.
It seems to me here that in common with many of the other areas of knowledge which have been explored in the 20th century, it is important to stress that one of the basic emphases in the knowledge about theater today is the idea that the theater essentially is a creative art. That the fact that it uses the script as a basic item should not therefore be interpreted as making it only an interpretive art. An interpretive art is an art in which one uses material in the same art to imitate. In other words, if I am a painter and I imitate a painting that someone else has already made, then I am imitating it. But if I paint a piece of sculpture, the solution of how that piece of sculpture should be created in terms of painting has not yet been solved for me. Therefore, even though I am using another art form, so to say, to copy from, it's no different than using a human being or any other object in nature, so to say, to paint from. And in this sense, it seems to me, first of all, that we should recognize the theater as today being a creative art.
You're listening to Lee Strasbeg on acting. The Creative Method. The actor as creator. One of 10 conversations with creative Americans about the nature of their work. The Creative Method, prepared by WGBH-FM in Boston under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center. Later we'll tell you how you may obtain excerpts from this and 21 other radio essays on the creative process in American arts, sciences, and professions. But now, Lee Strasbeg on acting.
I would say that the most characteristic part of the theater is unquestionably the actor. That is, any of the other elements are not exactly incidental, obviously, but the theater can do without scenery. It can do without the director. It can often even do without words. But it cannot do without the living actor. When you have no actor, you have no theater. Once you have an actor, you have theater.
We certainly have prima facie evidence of that in Thornton Wilder's biggest hit, Our Town, in which there is almost no scenery at all.
Yes, that's right.
But then you would certainly consider the actor essentially a creative artist.
Definitely. When you compare the various versions, let's say, of a particular performance, let's say a performance of Hamlet by different actors, you will find that they bear very little relation to the original, whatever the original may be. In fact, we hardly know what the original is intended to be or is intended to mean. Each time we see an actor in that part, we are really seeing an actor creating a different character, or rather a new character. You see. He may get his ideas from, obviously, the ideas of the author, in the same way that a painter who paints a certain object in nature is receiving his ideas and his impressions from that object. But what he does is dependent intrinsically on his own creative capacity, on his own imagination, on his own understanding, and on his own skill.
How can you draw a line between the imitative, the interpretive, and the creative? Where does one stop and the other start?
Well, in the first place, I don't think that is a question related purely to theater. In every art, we argue very much as to which is really creative and which is only imitative. On the whole, we tend to think that the creative thing, the creative approach, the creative method, if you wish, demands a fresh, original, and spontaneous experience of whatever it is that is being dealt with. Wherever that experience is only derived as an imitation of someone else's experience, it therefore, even when very good, tends only to be skillful rather than to be creative. However, on almost any definite given object in any field, there's a wide area of difference of opinion as to what people will call it.
Well then, from the standpoint of the creative method employed, you would say that there was a good close analogy between all of the performing arts.
No, not quite. In fact, that is one of the confusions, I think, that has plagued the understanding of the theater and especially of the art of acting. Regardless of the amount of creativity that may exist in some of the other arts, let's say in piano playing and violin playing, the fact remains that what the artist plays is set down in completely technical terms for that artist. The instrument is indicated, the actual rhythm with which the instrument should be played is indicated, the exact note which should be played is indicated. In fact, the entire language that is dealt with can be understood only by people that are in that art form. It has no meaning for anyone else. In the theater, it happens that the script can have a meaning and does have a meaning, separate from what one will see on the stage. It can have a meaning in the privacy of one's room when it is read as a literary work of art, and often is totally different from what one will perceive and what one will experience on the stage. Therefore, it does seem to me, without in any way trying to deny the significance of any of the other interpretive arts, that there is here a difference between the kind of creativeness which the actor must indulge in to translate the words or the intentions of the author into new kind of technical means, which is actually the way in which a human being thinks, experiences, behaves, and so on, which is in no way set down in a script, you see, and the way in which in some of the other arts, by means of a definite technical language, prescriptions, commands are given to each craftsman as to exactly what instrument he should use, which hand he should use, you see, and the sometimes even the extent of the pressure and certainly the kind and amount of rhythm, you see, even though even within that area there are still wide possibilities of agreement and disagreement.
Certainly the interpretive art is there at that point called in.
That's right.
Getting back to creative acting, can this be learned, or is it primarily a gift? Is this something that just comes as a bolt out of the blue that you're born with?
We don't, I think, today really know what we are born with. Our present knowledge assumes that the possibilities of a human being are vast, that they somehow do reside at birth in the human being, but obviously, without making an effort to discover them, they never appear. And therefore, we only know that they're there when we work to create them. Therefore, whether they are there or not is, for our purpose, immaterial. The important thing in the theater is that whereas in the other arts, we can leave this creative process to happen spontaneously and intuitively, because most of the other arts are individual. In other words, a painter, a composer, a writer can sit in the privacy of their own room. They try to perform, let's say, the thing, not to perform, but to create whatever it is that they have decided to create. Sometimes, suddenly, something happens and they create it. When it happens, we then simply say that they were inspired, in other words, when they were creative. However, when it doesn't happen, there's nothing lost. The composer simply says, well, it isn't going so well, I'll do it tomorrow. I mean, I didn't feel so well today, or something like that. If in the middle of the night he suddenly wakes up with a creative idea, he can work at that particular time. In other words, the creative process can take place intuitively and unconsciously. It does not need to be put into technical terms. However, the theater is different in that sense, that the performance must take place at a very definite stated time, and all the people participating in that performance must be ready to create. It therefore faces us before the problem of making conscious something which exists in the other arts, but does not need to be made conscious, but which, if it is not made deliberate and conscious in our art, is left so much to accident that the art itself becomes almost non-existent, that we cannot depend on it, that the performances vary so much from one time to another, that literally people have therefore been forced to question whether the art can rightly be called an art. Therefore, in modern times, we have tried to find, and that was the basic great contribution of Stanislavski, to find whether means could be found for consciously stimulating the creative process, which usually takes place unconsciously.
Could we define creative acting in any way?
There again, you see, we're up against, as I said before, the difficulty that exists in separating creative from non-creative in any area. To the extent that we can try to define it verbally, we would say, first of all, that the creative process tries to stimulate the entire human being who is involved in the craft, that is, who is to act. Not only the external means of the actor, not only, in other words, the voice, the speech, the gesture, but essentially the thinking, the thought, the sensitivity, the sensation, the emotion of the actor, the experience of the actor, so that he fuses completely with a kind of life that will have to be created on the stage. Here, by the way, I should perhaps diverge to make the point that when we say fuse completely, we don't mean that he experiences literally what the character is supposed to experience. That is a very false idea of what we mean by truly experiencing, you see. That would mean that an actor who had to kill would have to really want to kill and things of that sort. That is not at all the idea of experiencing. What it does mean is that whenever something is happening to the character, something real is happening to the actor, what is happening may be of a totally different, may come from a totally different source. But something is happening which for the audience must have the same validity, the same intensity, if you wish, or the same sense of aliveness, of truthfulness, you see, which the other kind of thing might ordinarily create for it, yes.
To what extent would you say that the creative method in acting is a collaboration with the writer, with the director, with the audience even?
Every act of creation is in that sense collaboration, if only between the artist and his material. Obviously, in an art like the theater, which is essentially a collective art, it is not dependent on any one individual. All the elements in it must be unified and related. And, by the way, it is equally important that the audience should share that experience in the theater. When it doesn't, the performance on the stage remains cold and almost non-existent.
And certainly the actors are always fully aware of the response that the audience is giving them.
Well, this is a very strange thing, or rather it's not a strange thing, but when you try to describe it, I must say it sometimes seems to sound strange or mystic. It is true that when one comes on the stage as an actor, one feels the presence of the audience as a single individual each night. And each audience each night almost has a definite character of its own, not a conglomerate character. And therefore, you appear on the stage, you say your first lines, and you know immediately this is going to be this type of individual, this type of audience. How that is accomplished, I must say I don't know. Psychologists, sociologists would perhaps be able to throw light on it. But the experience of that is quite true, even though it is a little flabbergasting when you experience it on the stage in actual performance.
What training, what kind of training is necessary to produce this creative actor we've been talking about?
I would say that the essential element in that is to train the inner faculties of the artist, not at the expense of or to the exclusion of the external elements, which are obviously important, but placing the stress and the emphasis on what we would ordinarily call the imagination of the actor, or which in this case I might describe as being the ability on the part of the actor to relive the experiences that have to be created on the stage.
Let me ask you a couple of more detailed questions along this line. I know you've worked directly with a number of our contemporary playwrights, is it a help or a hindrance to the really talented, skilled, creative actor to have the author of the play sitting in on rehearsals?
That can be answered in two ways. Essentially, and in principle, it always is a help, because at times, even when the author is vague about his intentions, which happens, unfortunately, sometimes too often, nonetheless, even that often gives the actor somehow a sense of what the author is getting at, even if he has not been able to explain himself completely. And especially when he's unable to explain himself completely, it often forces the actor to search further for something that the author is trying to get at, but which obviously he has not yet sufficiently created either in the text or by the explanations.
In other words, this would really be the true collaboration that we were talking about earlier.
So that in principle, it is very valuable and a very necessary thing in the theater that all the elements should, to that extent, collaborate. However, when the author should be present is a different problem, is actually an immediate problem. And often today, the author is present too soon. It is like a close friend watching an operation when he shouldn't be there. He's going to yell and scream because he sees the pain of the patient. He should not be there at that moment. He should be permitted after the operation is done, when the patient is in the bed, beginning to wake up and beginning to have some sense of where he is. In other words, when things are beginning to go, or at least when the actor has already found the things that he is searching for, that he needs to search for. Because let us not forget that, after all, the playwright took many months to write the play. Now the actor comes and is expected, sometimes in a few days, to make that tremendous transition into making this play or this part his own. It takes time, and often he is thrown by the presence of the author because he knows that the author already demands more. The author himself is unable to watch the work. He's unable to perceive the intentions of the actor. He watches only the results, and he says, well, it isn't getting there yet. That's not what I intended, and so on. So that sometimes there is difficulty and trouble simply from the fact that the author appears too soon or becomes involved in problems which are important at the end of the rehearsal and not necessarily at the beginning.
Well, can you at this point describe some of the specific steps that the actor goes through to prepare himself as a creative actor and in the preparation of a specific character?
Well, that implies that you can put things in pill form, and while that may be possible in science, where a pill can really be definitely mixed and it works on each individual, and even then sometimes it doesn't work on each individual, it is obviously much more difficult to do in this kind of craft, where the individual quotient is much more variable, and where you're dealing with conscious and unconscious emotions, reactions, and experiences, the existence of which you hardly are aware of and hardly dream of, and yet which nonetheless affect, so to say, the nature of the work. So that anything that I say should here be considered only as kind of notes, as Stanislavski put it. Anything that we say technically is meant only as notes at the time of difficulty. When you're unsure, when you don't quite know what to do, then it's wise to look at the compass and sort of find out what might be done. I would say that in working with the actor, in the first place, two essential stages can be differentiated. One is the stage of training, because if the actor is not sufficiently trained to do the kind of work that is demanded in production, then obviously the production work is very difficult to do, you see. And often you today have to take time and spend time to do work which in the other arts is done by the individual himself for many years, long before he has come to this moment of creation. The essential areas of training work are concerned with exactly those phases that we mentioned before. That is the awakening of belief in the actor, the training of the actor's concentration, the training of the actor's ability to respond to imaginary stimuli, the training of the actor's ability to experience and to re-experience emotions which have occurred to him or which occur freshly and newly, so to say, which he may never previously have had, but which once he has gone through, he learns to be able to repeat. This is all, in other words, the training in the control of his inner instrument. You see. When he then arrives at the rehearsal trained, the question is then only of the steps that he then goes through. And the steps that he goes through there are different for different people. Some people will go almost what seems coldly through the rehearsal period, learning the mechanical steps, where they should be, and more or less the outline of the business and so on, and with nothing more taking place. Then suddenly, sometimes when they get before the public, something happens. Something is turned on, like a light is turned on. Sometimes when they sit then in the privacy of their own room, when they start to put on the makeup, something happens. Sometimes they will go through, in the process of rehearsal, a great bewilderment. I've seen actors and those amongst the best often go through with real, almost labor pangs, the process of rehearsal. Literally, you question whether they are able to read the line or the word, whether they can read. That's actually because they are good actors, because they cannot simply read fluently and easily. The words must come out of the penetration of the character, out of being the character. And it takes them time before they come to it.
The character must grow within their own imagination.
Must grow within them. Now, in this growing process, there is no one step, you see. This is where the role of the director or the role of the teacher is therefore very, very important. Because the teacher, on the one hand, or the director, must perceive where the actual difficulty is, and sometimes not supply the answer, but simply open the door. Because the answer the individual himself must supply. Otherwise, usually you will supply an answer that is right for you, but that is not right for the individual whom you're dealing with. And there is too much, by the way, of that in the theater. We sometimes have the tendency to think that if I explain the part correctly, then the actor should be able to play it correctly. That would mean that the critic or anybody who could explain the part, the psychologist who could understand and explain the part, would therefore be the best actor. We know that that's not so. That the actor works with much deeper layers of awareness, of experience, of consciousness and unconsciousness. And the basic problem is to awaken these deeper areas by appealing either to the actor's conscious knowledge, by awakening the actor's conscious experience about the things that are being dealt with, by presenting to the actor's imagination experiences that will excite him, that will help him to understand what he's dealing with, but essentially to find the kind of experience that will explode within the actor himself, the burst, the flare of imagination. And sometimes that doesn't derive from anything that is very important. It may sometimes come from a small little remark that is made, from a color, from a sound, from a smell, from a sight, you see. A word that is thrown in and suddenly makes sense to an actor. And he says, don't tell me anymore, don't tell me anymore, I know what you mean. Because sometimes in explaining, we present such a clear picture to the actor of what we intend, that he therefore becomes very tied up in knowing what to do about it.
And this would tend to get in the way of his creative method.
Very much so, yes.
We have time for just a final question, and I would like to ask you one, speaking strictly from your standpoint as director and teacher. What is the advice that you give to young people who come to you wanting to go into the theater, into acting specifically as a career?
Well, it may seem strange, but in all honesty, the first thing I tell them is don't. I told that to my own daughter, and obviously it didn't help, you see. But I do that on the simple premise that work in the theater is so difficult. It takes so much out of an individual, even when he's successful. Parts don't come along too easily, and the success doesn't come along readily, you see, in one part after another, that one must be prepared for difficulties. Therefore, if my mere saying no is going to stop someone from being an actor, he should never try to be an actor to begin with. I therefore actually say that on principle, rather than out of any rational purpose, assuming that those people who will not listen to me at least have the right to make the attempt. But the people who listen to me, even if they have the talent, shouldn't obviously do it because they will not be able to take the pain, the suffering, the doubt, the difficulties which one does have to go through in the theater.
Just assuming that you tell this hypothetical young person not to go into the theater, and this does not alter this person's determination, can you give him any further advice as to how to begin and how to become a creative actor?
Well, I think the important thing for the young person to realize is that all of himself is used on the stage, and therefore that whatever he experiences in life will in some way come out on the stage at some time or other. And therefore the most important advice to give to anyone is to keep his imagination alive and open, to keep himself open to the impressions of life, to the things that are around him, to become aware of both his and other people's responses and reactions, so that he learns the nature of true behavior. Because otherwise, without that, most of the acting on our stage, both today and in past times, tends to take a very conventional kind of aura. That is not what we would call the creative approach or the creative method.
Lee Strasberg on acting. And here again is our host and commentator for the creative method, Lyman Bryson.
In Mr. Strasberg's very friendly but very stern advice to those who are ambitious to get into the theater, he destroys, it seems to me, some of the romantic elements in the picture of being an actor or a theater person that young people cherish. Even if you are gifted, and he's quite sure that you have to have talent in the first place, you have to begin with very strict technical training. No gifted amateurs can get very far in the theater, no matter how gifted they are. It's no matter of a sudden flare or of an inspiration, because you have to be at the theater when the audience is there. You have to turn your emotions on at the time when they're necessary to carry on the story of the play, and you have to turn them off and change them when the plot of the play demands it. In other words, you have to be under a very severe discipline. And of course, Mr. Strasberg is very famous in the theater world for his teaching of the Stanislavski method. As he himself says, that's a method of trying, at least, to condition oneself as an actor so that when an inspiration is needed, it is in some degree present. Although I myself have heard Mr. Strasberg say that even if the greatest of actors can never be quite sure that he's going to give a great performance, if he gives a great performance once in 3 or 4 times, that makes him a really great actor. In his own life, Mr. Strasberg has become almost as famous as a teacher, as a director, as an interpreter, not only in the actual production of stage plays, but in trying to convey, to get into the temperaments and the minds of gifted young people, these basic principles, that this art, like all the other great arts, calls upon all the highest and broadest qualities that anybody can have or acquire for himself, in addition to his necessary initial gifts.
Thank you, Dr. Bryson. You've heard Lee Strasberg, the actor as creator, one of 10 conversations furthering our understanding of creativeness in American arts and professions. The Creative Method is recorded by WGBH FM in Boston under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center. Producer Jack D. Summerfield with Lawlyn Thatcher and Bill Cavness as production associates.
This is the National Educational Radio Network.